I would like to talk, as Zubair said, a bit about what is still wrong, in addition to all the things that we have known are wrong and have not yet been able to fix with online ads. As Zubair mentioned, my research broadly focuses on security and privacy, ranging from both understanding today's systems, anticipating where future technology is headed and what will go wrong, and understanding the needs of users. And that has meant a broad range of work on different topics. I co-direct the Security and Privacy Research Lab at the University of Washington. And one area that we've done a lot of work in over the past, I think 10 years now, is in online tracking and online ads. So I'm excited to talk with you more about that and also hear your thoughts and possible connection points. So the original motivation for this work was actually not in ads specifically, even though we had done a lot of past work on the ad ecosystem. And see, sounds good. Okay, I was just checking the chat to make sure there's nothing important. So we've done a lot of past work in ads, but at the same time, because of our broad focus on security and privacy in general, we have also started looking at mis and disinformation online more generally. For example, understanding how users assess potential misinformation on social media and so on. And as part of that work, one question that arose for us several years ago was around the role of ads in online mis and disinformation. Because we had done so much past work on ads, that was an ecosystem that we were familiar with. And thinking about misinformation online, we realized that, of course, while much of the research community worries about misinformation on social media and on first-party websites, in fact, in the experience of many users on the web, perhaps not you in the audience, I suspect there's a higher than average incidence of ad blocker usage here. But for many users of the web, a lot of the content that they see, a significant fraction of the content that they see on web pages actually comes from ads. So for example, you've probably in this screenshot already identified where the ads are, but this is a screenshot from a news site where you can see on the top actual news articles from that site, and on the bottom, what I've outlined in red are these so-called native ads that are actually advertisements. They're placed there, just like all the advertisements that might be more identifiable, but they're styled to look like news articles. And if you were less familiar with this or not giving it a careful look, you might interpret these as being actually part of the page and not placed there by third parties. So the initial research question we had going in was to understand specifically the role of ads in the spreading of misinformation and disinformation. For instance, the incidence of ads on mis and disinformation sites, the fraction of ads that might contain misinformation or lead users further down a rabbit hole to misinformation sites. So these were the initial questions, quite specific questions that we started with. And I'll answer those a little bit in this talk. But since then, and actually quite quickly, our work broadened into thinking more generally about different types of problematic content in ads, not just outright misinformation. So I think as many of you probably know, and as Zubair hinted also, there's been a lot of work in the security and privacy community, including from people who are here, studying the online ad ecosystem over the last 10 plus years in various ways. And much of that work has focused, including our own work, has focused on the mechanisms of the targeting and the tracking, the privacy concerns associated with that tracking and so on. As well as in some cases, looking at problematic things that might be spread through ads at kind of a technical level. So malware that might be spreading through ads and directly exploiting vulnerabilities in browsers. And so these are all quite technical questions, and they happen below the surface of what the user may be seeing in the ads. And so what we realized when we stumbled upon this misinformation question was that actually there's a broader question to ask about user visible content in the ads. What is the user visible content of these ads? We kind of anecdotally are familiar with all of these types of achy ads like the ones I've shown on this slide. So clickbait or borderline misinformation or things that catch your attention because they look gross or shocking or sexual. These ads, it turns out, are all over the web. And what we wanted to understand then more generally is what is happening in the ad ecosystem at the content level. What is it that users are seeing? When people are seeing large fractions of content on news sites that is actually filled with these ads, what is that content and what are the different ways in which it's problematic, including misinformation, but also other issues? So in my view now, this kind of rounds out a lot of the concerns that we're thinking about with online advertising. And like I said, this is something that our lab has been thinking about for a while, as well as many, many others. There's a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of great work that's constantly iterating and building on these questions at the same time that the actual ecosystems are evolving. So it's not a question that we look at this ecosystem once and we know all the answers. Things are actually substantially different now than they were 10 years ago. And so I've just included on this slide the citations from our lab, looking at, like I said initially, privacy, also the potential privacy implications of targeting, and more recently, this line of work studying problematic content. So that last line of work is what I'll be focusing on today. So to make this a little bit more explicit, the research questions that we've been thinking about with this line of work is really around what is the content in ads on the web. We've been focusing on web ads specifically so far, although there are parallels to many of the issues you might have seen or read about and that other labs are looking at for Facebook ads or YouTube ads or other ads. But we've been focusing specifically on web ads, so ads that are appearing on news sites, for instance, and trying to understand what are the types of potentially problematic content that appear in these ads? Can we characterize this type of content, and can we draw lines between things that are okay but annoying and things that are not illegal but really more fundamentally problematic in some ways? And so we've done that both from a researcher perspective, from our analysis of the ad ecosystem, as well as from a user perspective. So I'll talk about a study in which we elicited user reactions to many of the ads that we had collected to validate and expand our researcher-created taxonomy of problematic content. And so then a lot of our questions have been driven by web measurement methodologies. So understanding how prevalent these different types of ad content are, who is creating and serving these ads, and what types of websites these ads appear on. So the first question that I've hinted at a little bit, but is probably looming large in your mind, is what does problematic content mean here? I've been throwing this word around, and the short answer is that it's not entirely clear. This is a question that our research has also been circling for a long time. It's one thing to measure more technical properties of the web to say, like, yes, this is a third party, but to make more qualitative assessments of the content has actually been a huge challenge of this work, and has been a huge lift by my PhD students in particular, who have looked at enough ads that they can probably write very strange memoirs about their PhD experience. But just to give you a sense, this is what I'll show you on this slide is loosely based on a taxonomy that we developed in our first paper on this topic, which was published at the Conpro workshop a couple of years ago. And this was a taxonomy of problematic content that we created based on doing a qualitative manual content analysis of a bunch of ads that we collected on news and misinformation sites. And I'll give you some of the more quantitative results from that study a bit later, but just to give you a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about problematic content, roughly ranging from annoying and less problematic to more annoying or more problematic and potentially illegal. So on the one hand, we have things that are essentially just trying to get clicks and provide little value in terms of content. And we see kind of a spectrum of increasingly problematic techniques to get those clicks. So one common thing is just regular clickbait, things that, evoke emotions, that have gossipy flavors and so on. And really, they're just trying to get people to click, visit other websites that themselves have little content on them, but have a whole bunch of ads. So they're just trying to increase ad revenue. So this is, not high quality content, but maybe not problematic to the level of malware that we might think about from a traditional security perspective. Then we start to see things that look more like like advertisements, but advertisements that are poorly disclosed. And so now maybe starting to get into the realm of what the FTC might consider deceptive. So for example, advertorials for insurance, we see enough of that it's almost its own category, or other product advertorials. So these are ads that, again, look like news articles, and they often have headlines like news articles. But when you click on them, they take you to a page that, again, is styled like a news article. In fact, we've seen examples of kind of phishing style techniques where there'll be some random domain, but it'll be using, a Fox News logo or something like that. It'll look like an article, but actually be trying to sell something. It'll be sometimes disclosed explicitly as an advertorial, sometimes less so. And as I think many of us in the security community know, communicating things to users effectively is challenging enough in and of itself, let alone when you're trying to be deceptive. This goes further into more and more problematic types of content. So investment pitches or other things that might impact people's decisions about money. A lot of content related to health and supplements. Things that are potentially actually selling things, but are circumventing, FDA medical regulations. Then we see this category of clickbait and misinformation, which I've lumped together here, and is most related to kind of our initial research question. In some sense, clickbait is just something that's trying to entice you to click, but often we see it, and I'll talk more about a study we did around the election with a lot of examples like this one I've shown on the slide. Often we see it in the form of a kind of salacious news headline like this that is not quite misinformation. This headline says, a viral video exposes something fishy in Biden's speeches. This ad came from sometime around the election. This is not actually a really falsifiable statement. If you go to the article and read it, the article itself is actually quite vacuous, but it implies something that has, political content and may impact people's perceptions as they are thinking about voting. And I'll talk more about examples like that later. We also see explicitly manipulative design patterns. Like I'll show more examples of this style later. This is the most common style we've seen, which is something that looks like a poll, especially in the political context. So ads that look like they have interactive elements that are trying to engage users in providing an opinion or something else that encourage clicks. And finally, we see things that are maybe the closest to traditional security concerns, which are potentially unwanted or likely unwanted software downloads, where it may take you to a page and make it seem like you need to download a browser extension to continue, or include kind of deceptive design elements in the ad to get you to click. So I'll come back at the end of the talk a little bit, talking about my thoughts about, why these things matter and why they're problematic. But maybe one thing I'll say now is that these are often not falling into the category of traditional security vulnerabilities. They're not exploiting technical vulnerabilities in browsers. They're more, in some sense, exploiting vulnerabilities in the human brain. And a lot of for example, the misinformation work that we've done kind of conceptualizes this similarly. And a lot of these ads are actually not even against the policies of the ad platforms themselves, or they don't quite cross the line into something that would violate things that the FTC might be interested in. And yet, I think these ads are, they're problematic in that they're a huge fraction of what people see in the content that they browse on the web today. And so as we started looking into this content and as people who typically used ad blockers, in some ways being shocked at just how low quality a lot of this content is, we really wanted to understand, not just the financial and the privacy role of ads in the ecosystem, but also the information that they are adding to the ecosystem of what people are consuming. Okay, so this rough taxonomy here, these examples came from our researcher-driven labeling of ads. And one question that we had open at that time was, what are people's perceptions of these ads? To the extent that we as researchers, have certain understandings of how the ecosystem works. does that actually map to ways in which users might find these ads to be problematic? So we ran a two-part study to understand and quantify why users dislike ads and which ads they dislike. I think a lot of these results are not surprising per se in that they validate much of our existing taxonomy, but it is now based on actual participants in a study and not our potentially in some ways biased perspective as researchers. So the two-part study first involved developing, based on participant responses, a taxonomy of reasons for disliking ads. So we had a set of 30 ads that we had curated that represented these different categories that we had identified in our earlier work, and then asked participants to respond to those ads for reasons that they liked and disliked them. And then we did a qualitative analysis of their free responses. And so this list on the slide is essentially the user-generated categories for reasons that they don't like ads. That includes many of the overlapping categories that I mentioned before. Some of the reasons for not liking them are just, that the ads are ugly or have poor design. But the ones that people have really strong opinions about are the ones that are more on the spectrum of deceptive, feel somehow scammy, make the person feel uncomfortable, or evoke disgust or something like that. So to give you just a couple of examples with participant quotes, the top one here is an example of something that is in the offensive or uncomfortable or distasteful category. And this is this image of somebody looking at something in a dirty washing machine or something like that. And the participant says, the words are okay, but the image is gross. We see a lot of gross images in these types of clickbait ads. I think that if you are using an ad blocker already, me showing you these slides will convince you to never turn it off. We also see a lot of ads that people's gut reaction is that they are scammy in some way. So, for example, this one here, the participant said, it seems like a scam and does not seem like it comes from a reputable source. So there's a category of ads that people are using the same techniques that we've seen them use in misinformation contexts with social media, like assessing the source or other things that don't quite pass the sniff test. Okay, so this was about these ads we had curated. And so now we get this list. And so the next thing we did as part of this study was select a large sample of ads from a new crawl we had done of news websites and have panels of participants label those ads according to this taxonomy, essentially, or these sets of opinions labels. So now we had a large survey with 1,000 participants labeling 500 ads. So we had each ad labeled 10 times by different participants among the pool based on, like I said, that previous taxonomy. And we had sampled those 500 ads from the top 3,000. I don't recall now if it was the top 3,000 websites or the top 3,000 news websites. And so then we clustered so then we had these kind of panel labelings for each ad. We had 10 labels, and then we were able to automatically cluster those into 16 kind of thematically distinct clusters based on those user opinion labels that we then analyzed again as researchers looking for kind of more objective descriptors of those clusters. So I'll give you the examples of ads from two clusters that users disliked the most. I kind of correspond exactly to those examples I showed you before. And here's some more fun examples just for your viewing pleasure or displeasure. So one very disliked cluster, again, these scammy and untrustworthy ads. That's where a lot of these like software download things come in, the health and supplement ads, the poorly disclosed advertorials, those types of ads tended to show up in this cluster. You can see examples there again. And you can see that here we are combining some of the labels from the opinion taxonomy that I had earlier. So these are not mutually exclusive, but based on the opinion labels, this is the cluster that kind of has these characteristics. These are highly deceptive, highly clickbaity, poorly designed ads. Then we also have in another cluster, related but separate cluster, these distasteful and gross ads. So these ones are not so deceptive, but they are more clickbaity. They're human interest, they're gossipy, they are gross, they are sensational, and they're often low in quality content as well. Okay, so at the highest level for me as a researcher, the outcome of this study was that it gave us some validation that the categories that we had independently developed as researchers in looking at these ads aligned with what participants were also labeling when we showed them these ads. And we can use both taxonomies, both our researcher created one and these user labels, to kind of look at the same question, which is ultimately one of the key questions we were interested in our measurement studies, which is how prevalent are these ads on the web? So I'll show you the answer. The short answer is they're quite prevalent, more so than at least I personally thought before I turned off my ad blocker. But I'll show you two different perspectives on that. So one is from the user study data set. So for this random sample of ads, these 500 ads from the top 3,000 websites, these were the breakdowns of the most popular opinion labels. So this was what you're seeing here is the percentage of ads among all ads labeled, where at least half of the labelers agreed on that label. So for example, this 20% clickbait, that means 20% of the randomly selected ads had at least half of the 10 labelers agree that this was a clickbait ad. So we can kind of, collapse that and say, basically a fifth of the ads that we randomly selected from this sample are clickbaity ads. That's actually, I don't know if that's high or low. Maybe depends on your perspective in coming into this question, but that's a substantial fraction of the ads that people are seeing on the web. We saw similar, if not higher results. One thing I'll actually say about this previous graph is, again, these are not mutually exclusive. So it's not the case that you can sum up all of the red bars here. For example, there's some overlap between ads that are labeled deceptive and labeled clickbait, for example. In our earlier study where we had done the researcher labeling of ads, so here we are showing the fraction of ads that we labeled as problematic in one of essentially the categories that I showed you examples of earlier. And what we were doing in this study was looking at ads not just on top news websites, but also on top misinformation websites. So the 100 most popular misinformation websites, according to other classifications of misinformation or low quality news sites that we drew from. So there we also looked at home pages as well as article pages, because those may be different in terms of what ads are served there. And again, we see really high fractions of ads that are problematic according to something in our taxonomy. So on some of the article pages, more than half of the ads that show up on these sites are potentially problematic in one of these ways. And again, the definition of problematic is a spectrum. So this data doesn't quite reflect that spectrum. But if we're thinking of, the role of advertising in the web as being something that financially supports these websites, potentially gets useful content to people, that's kind of in the ideal world, that's the win-win. The user side is not winning here. We can also look at which ad platforms serve these ads. And if you're familiar with the ad ecosystem, the answers here might not be surprising, but there are concentrated ad networks that tend to serve the really problematic style of ads, especially those native ads that look like articles and are often very clickbaity. So if we look at, again, this is our researcher coded data. There are native ad platforms that you may have heard of before, like Taboola or Outbrain. These tend to serve more problematic native style ads. But there's also, of course, big platforms like Google, who serves just such a huge volume of ads overall that just because of that volume in our data set, a lot of the problematic or native ads are still coming through Google's ad networks. Likewise, we can look at for a given ad network, what's the fraction of ads that we see from that ad network that are problematic? So it's not just that some of these ad networks are serving a lot of the problematic ads. It's also that most of the ads they are serving at all are problematic. So that's where we can see again some of these native ad platforms. And again, we see a non-trivial fraction of ads coming through Google here as well. And then finally, in the context of our measurement research questions, we were interested in understanding which sites do problematic ads appear on. In our initial study on this, when we were still thinking about this as particularly a misinformation related research question, as I mentioned, we were looking at both top news sites and top misinformation sites. And we went in with the hypothesis that the misinformation sites are lower quality sites. They will have lower quality ads. And in fact, what we found was that difference, this is the same graph that you saw before, that difference was not so substantial. You can see on the first part of, essentially you can compare the two green bars to each other, the first two green bars and the first two blue bars. This is the top news sites and the top misinformation sites. And they both on article pages have over 50% of the ads as problematic in one of our categories. And so we were a bit surprised by this initially in that it didn't validate our hypothesis that we would find misinformation sites to be worse. But I think it underscores the core role of the ad ecosystem in financially supporting, even the top news sites. One thing I will add to this is that this is lumping all of these sites together, and it's not the case that these problematic ads are evenly distributed. So we did find, for example, on the top 100 news sites, that about half of them serve problematic ads, half of them serve non-problematic ads, like regular ads that look like they are clearly advertising a product, and then a few serve no ads at all. One thing I haven't told you about is exactly how we collected these ads and so on. I'll dig into that more in the next section of the talk when I'll go in depth into one project.
Can I just jump in and I was shocked that Google was serving ads on misinformation sites? That sounds unbelievable.
Yes. It may be different now. Actually, I wonder, this data was collected in, I want to say end of 2019. So it's possible that the ecosystem has changed a bit since then. There's been a lot more attention on ad networks and advertisers financially supporting misinformation sites. So it's possible it's changed since then. But yeah, frankly, Google's ad networks are so widely spread. There's also a question of what constitutes a misinformation site and what might we as researchers consider misinformation or low quality news site. What crosses the line for Google to say we're going to take things off of this site? I think those are probably complicated decisions on their part that are not totally aligned with what we might put in our list.
Got it. Interesting.
To follow up on that, I mean, it seems like it's very difficult to draw the line, right? So I guess in general, when we report something to a vendor, in this case, it'll be an advertising network, perhaps. They need to make a decision, right? Okay, am I going to take it down or not? And I guess I don't even know if they have a standard for how to decide what needs to be taken down or not. So maybe that's part of the problem.
I think you're right. And this is, frankly, this is something that we've struggled with in this work as well, which is, where is the line? Can we define a line? What should the line be, or what could the line be? Clearly there's, some degree of, just because an ad is crappy doesn't mean the ad should be removed. And where is the line of how crappy it should be? And so I think, to me, part of the reason that I've been interested in doing this work is to understand this ecosystem, to understand what things might be problematic. I'll talk a bit about, potential future work about really more directly understanding the potential harms on people, to help draw those lines. But I think, I think as hinting in the chat, I think crappy clickbait ads are not illegal, but they are having potentially negative impacts on our information ecosystems. And so it's hard to say. Actually, we often, even if you read the policies of some of these ad networks, some of the ads we see might be arguably across their policy lines, but not necessarily. And so it might be, some of it might be a question of detection, but some of it is probably a question of gray, fuzzy lines there. There's a question from Haroon also in the chat, which is a very good question, which is about the delivery of problematic ads with contextual targeting, so based on the site visited, versus behavioral targeting, so based on the user's profile. Our research so far has mostly focused on contextual targeting. So for instance, when we went in with this research question of comparing news and misinformation sites, and in most of our crawls, we have been keeping the user profile constant, so that we are looking essentially just at contextual targeting. Does the website you're on impact how many problematic ads you see? And there are some differences, but not dramatic. We have ongoing work still looking at what is the impact of people's browsing history, user profiles on those things. I don't know what the outcomes will be, but there are definitely, one of the concerns here is that people who are uniquely vulnerable in certain ways might be more targeted by these ads, not necessarily even intentionally by advertisers, but by the outcome of, the machine learning magic of the ad ecosystem. So for example, the supplement and kind of health related scammy ads often relate to medical conditions that are probably more likely in older adults. So I wouldn't be surprised if older adults tend to see more of those types of ads. A question from Fanny about disclosure. We have not usually disclosed ads to the news sites. I think the question of transparency and disclosure and so on it's an important one, and I'll talk more about that a bit later as well in some ongoing work that we're doing. And then question about problematic ads being distributed via web notifications. Interesting. What do you mean by that?
Oh, yeah. So we did a study on malicious ads served via web push. And I was wondering if you have seen, we focused on social engineering attacks, pure, quite clear social engineering attacks. But I was wondering if you have thought about looking into, problematic ads, but served by, native apps on mobile, but also browser notifications.
That's really interesting. Not concretely, no. We occasionally think about expanding to, I suspect there's kind of unique characteristics, but also overlapping characteristics of content on social media ads and mobile ads and web ads and, TikTok and Twitter and Facebook ads and so on. So I think that's fascinating. We have not looked at that, but it would be very interesting.
Thank you.
Cool. Great. Thank you all for the questions.
We do have one in the room as well. We do have a question.
Oh, yeah, please.
I just want to ask a question because you said that the ads don't fall in standard cybersecurity categories. But I've seen that you mentioned some ads that make you download the unwanted softwares. But are these software malwares? Because I've seen them often on web pages, like these green download buttons. Are these software malwares or just unwanted software in general?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. The short answer is I don't know. We did not download and analyze the software. I suspect they're often browser extensions. I wouldn't be surprised if they are, I'm just guessing here, things that are harvesting data or injecting more ads or something like that. But I don't know. It would be an interesting question. Okay, so let me talk a bit about more in-depth one of our studies. What I've talked about so far kind of gives you a sense of our motivation here, how we're thinking about problematic ads, what we've seen in terms of prevalence in more generic studies on the web. And now almost 2 years ago, in the fall of 2020, we had set up all this measurement infrastructure and done these that are already described. And so then we had this opportunity leading up to the 2020 US elections to collect ads on news and media websites throughout the time of the election and look specifically for problematic content in political ads. To be a little bit more concrete here about the methods, which in some ways overlap the methods of our earlier crawls as well. We ran crawls daily from about 6 weeks before to about 6 weeks after the election. We actually intended to stop the crawls sooner, but then so many things happened after the election that we continued running until Inauguration Day. We used the crawler that we had built already for the earlier studies, which is a web crawler that uses Puppeteer, which some of you may be familiar with. It's a browser automation library. And essentially on each page, the crawler automatically identifies ads using ad blocker filter lists and then saves a screenshot of every ad on the page. And so this is a little bit different from much of the other measurement work that even we had done previously, and that we're really interested in the content and less the underlying mechanisms of the third parties and how those ads are served. So we did these daily crawls on nearly 800 news and media websites. We excluded social media sites like Facebook. Facebook, of course, has its own ad ecosystem, its own ad library, and so on. And so we were just focusing on web ads like CNN, local TV stations, and again, our list of misinformation sites that were ones that fact checkers had identified as misinformation or other low quality news. And this included, especially relevant to this study, this included highly partisan sources kind of on both the left and the right in US politics. And as I mentioned, in response to one of the questions, our goal was really to focus on contextual ad targeting, not on user profiles. So we wanted to understand, for instance, how do left-leaning and right-leaning sites differ in terms of the ads that are targeted on those pages. So we essentially used a static browser profile or a rough, I put clean in quotes here because as many of you know, targeting and tracking is happening in all sorts of ways. And so we were not literally using like a separate machine and a separate IP address for each one. But as clean as possible with no prior cookies or history, clean browser profile and so on for each run. For each domain. We also crawled via VPNs from different locations in the United States that we thought would be politically interesting. So some sites that were clearly left-leaning, clearly right-leaning in terms of their voting, and toss-up states. After the election, Arizona and Georgia turned out to be locations of interest that we had not been crawling before. So we switched a couple of our crawlers over to crawling Arizona and Georgia to see the ads specifically there as ongoing election-related events were still happening. We then had, I'll talk briefly through this kind of rather large analysis pipeline of dealing with all of this content, and maybe gives you a sense of kind of the pain and engineering lifting that some of my students have been doing to get all this content analyzed. So the ads data set that we got from these crawls is about 1.4 million ads total. That includes not just the political ads, but all the ads that we collected. We then extracted the text with OCR from those ads, deduplicated them to some extent to make the processing easier, and then did some language modeling to, again, kind of narrow down the set that we needed to process manually. So we did some topic modeling to kind of identify popular topics among those ads. We also trained a custom political ad classifier to identify just the political themed ads in the data set. One thing to emphasize here is that we were looking at political ads in a very general way. So not just ads that might appear in Google and Facebook's kind of political and issue ads library. So things that are disclosed as political ads by political parties. We include those as well, but also things like Clickbait that mention Trump and Biden. Those are also our political ads in the context of our research questions here. And then finally, we did, again, a huge lift in terms of qualitatively analyzing many of these ads to look at the potentially problematic techniques in them. So our paper, which was published at IMC, has lots more details about, the overall structure of the data set and some things we saw over time and so on, and the common topics outside the political ads. For today, I'm going to skip all that and just give you a brief sense of what the political ads look like here, and then give you some case studies of the problematic content within those political ads. So we see about 56,000 political ads among the 1.4 million ads we have total. And we see those roughly in three categories. One are these explicit campaign and advocacy ads. These are about 40% of the political ads we saw. These are more like the ones that you would find in Google's and Facebook's ad libraries for political ads. We also see a decent number, 8% of the political ads are political product ads. So these are ads, I'll talk a bit more about them in a minute, but these are basically ads that are advertising products with some political theme. And then finally, a huge fraction of them are these political news and media ads. And again, these are the ones that are not caught by the existing ad transparency platforms, because they are not explicitly labeled as political ads. They're not being run by official political campaigns, but they contribute to the political information environment that people are exposed to, leading up to and surrounding the election. So I'll dive into a couple of these problematic case studies. Maybe before I dig into this, actually, one thing I'll say is the good news is we didn't find anything, completely terrible. One thing that we were worried we might see, for example, is ads that were spreading incorrect information about how to vote or what the day of the election was, things like that, or even who won the election. We actually didn't see any of that. Then that doesn't mean it didn't exist. It could just mean that we didn't see it for various reasons. But it at least means that it wasn't so widespread or slipped through the monitoring of the ad platforms. There was also a political ad ban by at least Google during some of this time. So maybe the good news is some of this ecosystem is working. Nobody was lying about the outcome of the election here. But we still see kind of these things in the gray area that we've been talking about in a lot of these ads. So the most common type of manipulative pattern we see are these misleading political opinion polls. There are so many variants of these that we've seen kind of, on both sides of the political spectrum that look like they're kind of leveraging people's political motivation to vote in polls or sign petitions on topics that are controversial. And, you may be wondering what's the trick here. Part of the trick, I think, is just getting people to click. But it actually goes deeper than that. Once you click on them, they often actually ask you to register your vote to insert your email address. And doing so often subscribes you to mailing lists, which then include a plethora of additional problematic content. There was sometime a couple of years ago, there was also a study at Princeton looking at the manipulative techniques in these political mailings. And so in some ways, these problematic ads are a path into that ecosystem where now we're seeing more concrete kind of misinformation and privacy harms. There's also this category of political products. These, sometimes are just legitimate product ads with political themes, but also had a relatively high concentration of problematic techniques. So there are a lot of kind of political memorabilia, a lot of $2 bills. Our topic modeling showed that most of these were Trump related, and it was not uncommon to see kind of these bait and switch tactics of having products that are free, but then requiring you to pay for shipping and handling in a way that's not super clearly disclosed. So again, we didn't try buying any of these things. So, I assume we would have actually gotten products. I guess that's another question we could have looked at. So again, these are, probably not outright scams, but they are, leveraging this political climate for profit in ways that, that may be at least distasteful in some ways. We also saw ads that were not directly for products, but were kind of advertising like financial information or trying to lure consumers into get rich quick schemes, or political products that are kind of leveraging hot button political issues in various ways, like this ad for hearing devices that's referencing Trump signing a bill into law. So again, these are not ads that are overtly political or overtly illegal, but you could imagine someone browsing the web, learning about, developing their opinion on who to vote for. All this type of content is there and not always distinguishable from the legitimate content on the page. That is especially true for this last set of problematic ads. These are the ones that fascinate me personally the most, and which are these clickbait political news ads. And the reason they fascinate me is that their actual intent and their potential impact is different. So the actual intent, I think, of these types of articles, these are the ones that come through ad platforms like Taboola. They look like news articles. They have sensationalist headlines. Their actual intent is not to spread information. It's not about the headline. It's all to drive clicks. They usually go to relatively vacuous articles or content farms or listicles that are just serving more ads. They're trying to get clicks. They're trying to get more ad revenue. They're not trying to spread information, but they look like they're spreading information. And they often, drive these clicks in part by doing things that are very sensationalist, implying controversy about different political figures, making misleading statements, and so on. And to me, what's really concerning about these is that they are contributing to this muddy information environment that people are consuming, as they are learning about the current state of the world and deciding which politician to vote for or not vote for, or who to trust. And one concern I have is that it doesn't require even clicking on these articles for them to potentially be influencing people's understanding of the world. In fact, if you click on them and actually read the underlying article, they're usually disappointing. For example, there's one, I remember that was something like, you wouldn't believe what Trump said to his son. And when you read the underlying article, it's just like a list of facts about Trump's son. There's nothing, that promised you something salacious and it didn't deliver. Likewise, the viral video about something fishy in Biden's speeches is something about how he plagiarized his speeches from himself and gave examples of his past speeches that were just standard things politicians say. So, but when you see this headline often enough, contributing to people's confirmation bias and so on. I just find these ads, both fascinating and infuriating. They're not trying to spread political information, but in fact they are. And so they, especially in the context of our current political climate, they really concern me in that sense. All right. Finally, I'll give you one more example, just because this is my favorite example. I can't believe this is a real ad. So the Republican National Committee ran this actual ad in Georgia that looks like a Windows XP prompt. I don't know if this is intended to be misleading, and perhaps also the demographic of users who might see this ad might have older operating systems. I don't know. Or if this is just intended to be a joke. I don't know what the intent is. But it's just funny, and I wanted to share it with you all. Okay, so in the last few minutes, I've given you a lot of opinions about why I think this matters, even though these are not traditional computer security and privacy issues. I think I'm concerned both about the methods and also about the impacts. In terms of the methods, I'm concerned about, the deceptive and manipulative techniques that these ads use, kind of in line with a lot of research about dark patterns and manipulative techniques that we've seen in lots of different contexts lately. In the context of the political ads in particular, the leveraging of, political climate and political controversy for profit while having an impact on, people's political opinions potentially as a side effect. And then more fundamentally, I've more and more been thinking about a lot of my work, both here and around misinformation and around augmented reality, as rather than exploiting technical systems, we're seeing the exploitation of the human brain and cognitive biases that we have and so on. And I think there's value in viewing that as part of computer security and better understanding the impacts and defensive strategies. So in terms of impacts, much of this is hypothesized. We haven't done studies with people except to ask them about their opinions, but not directly on the impacts. So I think there's work to be done here that could help move this conversation forward and helping us understand, is there a line to be drawn? Are these annoying or just harmful? Are these just annoying or are they actively harmful? But depending on the ad, potential impacts on users include, on the one hand, money for some of these, political products or supplement scams, essentially. Giving up private information, like through the polls, health through misinformation spreading about health. A lot of these clickbait ads are about health conditions. Doctors have been keeping the secret from you about how to blah, blah, blah. But also just, time and well-being. These ads are not, they're not pleasant. They're wasting people's time. They're disgusting, they're shocking, and so on. And when we are inundated with all of this content all day, as we extrapolate to think about what this will look like in our future systems, like what will ads look like in augmented reality, I don't think that we want the extrapolation of this in our future augmented reality system. And as I've talked about a little bit already, what really concerns me about a lot of these ads is that even if they are not explicitly spreading misinformation, they are muddying this information ecosystem in ways that may have impacts that we don't quite realize, especially those of us who don't even see these ads through our ad blockers. And as I also mentioned in response to someone's question about this, this is also just a hypothesis, but I also worry about the disparate impact for different vulnerable populations in terms of how these ads and how different types of problematic ads may be targeted at, older adults or different demographic groups who may have certain susceptibility to some of these techniques or to some of these harms. So in terms of what we should do about this, well, on the one hand, I think we should, continue doing research on this. And it's been not just us. There's also been work, for instance, at NYU, folks looking at Facebook ad content, YouTube ad content, and so on. And I think kind of pulling ad content into what we should think about when we think about researching the ad ecosystem is one big lesson here. But in terms of concretely what to do immediately, I think there are some opportunities for improved content moderation by the ad platforms, especially in some cases that have more potential impact for harm, like around the political ads. We already see some self-regulation and beyond of the political ads that are, come from campaigns and so on. But what we saw in our data, we would suggest, taking this definition of political to be more broad because of, the potential impacts. And in some ways, Google and Facebook took this into account as well when they had their ad bans around the time of the election. But as we've seen, not all ad platforms are created equal. So more standard enforcement of these things across different ad platforms would be beneficial. I think there's also a lot of value in transparency. There's all this stuff that we saw that was not in the official, Google and Facebook political ad transparency because they weren't these official political ads. And in general, the challenge with this ecosystem is that everybody sees different things. Even with our relatively expansive crawls, we are only seeing some ad campaigns. And I'm sure there's a lot that we're missing. And so I think there's also an opportunity and a role for transparency here, both for consumers, also regulators, also the ad platforms, and also the websites themselves. Because, even website designers, when they build their site, they don't have full control over or even knowledge of what ads get shown to whom on their site. And finally, there may be a role for tools for users, such as, ad blockers, of course, or also more specific tools that might target problematic content in particular. In the context of experimenting with one of these tools, we actually the other day ran across another one of my favorite ads. This is a real ad. Most U.S. residents don't know how to block ads. Do it now. I love it. It takes you to a real page that explains to you something about ad blockers. Actually, I think it was a subscription-based ad blocker or something like that. How well it does, I don't know. That might be another interesting research question. So, I think why have we been looking at ad content? It's because ads make up a fundamental part of the web, not just, in its technical construction, but also in the content that real people see every day, all the time. And in much of our work, we've kind of accidentally been ignoring it as content. And so I think there are, as I've described, there are implications in future work for researchers, ad platforms, policymakers. This is work that we are continuing to do in our group, looking at some of these open questions that I've mentioned. I would love to hear about other related work or ideas that folks are doing. We're also collaborating with Consumer Reports at the moment towards some of these transparency goals, to do continued data collection and make available large ad data sets like our election ad data set, to allow other research to build on top of that and to answer other research questions that we didn't get to or we didn't think of, and so on. So if you have thoughts, I would love to hear them. This work was, of course, in collaboration. I've mentioned a few times, the hard work that my students have been doing. So Eric and Miranda and Theo in particular did a lot. Eric in particular has been driving a lot of this effort for years, has looked at more ads than I should actually ask him. He's defending his dissertation soon. I should ask him to report on how many ads he thinks he has looked at as part of his research. And Miranda and Theo also played a key role in the political ads project. And then Yoshi Kono is my lab co-director, who's also collaborated with us on this work. So with that, I think we are basically out of time. I'd love to answer a few more questions if folks have them, or please feel free to reach out to me through whatever channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your ideas, or hear about your related work.
Thank you very much. Great talk. And I think we have a bunch of questions already, so I will directly hand over. So first, Nick.
Thank you, Franzi, for the great talk. I have a question regarding your crawler for collecting ads. So it seems to me that your desire to have an automated crawler that collects ads is in direct contradiction with the desires of ad companies to keep click fraud down.
Yeah.
So I would guess that the more you're crawling for ads, the less of a quality visitor you are inferred to be. And so the more they're giving you the lower and lower quality ads. So eventually, you're scraping the bottom of the barrel, and you may very well be observing ads that no real user is getting. So I was wondering about your opinions and whether you've actually tried to see of the quality of ads that you're getting in some sort of temporal, longitudinal fashion.
Yeah, this is a really good question. And there's actually two implications of the concern. So the concern being basically like, we're crawling, we don't look like a real user. For one, that means we may not be getting all the ads. There may be problematic ads out there that we're not getting. So for example, maybe we, actually one example is that if we click through on the Trump campaign ads, we actually can't see the homepage. They detect us as a bot. So there's evidence that we do not look like a real person. And I think it's a valid concern. So there's I don't know the answer to the question of if we compare our crawled ad data with if we had actually collected like 1.4 million political ads from real people during that time. How would those data sets differ? I don't know. I think that's a really important question. We do have an ongoing project right now where we collected ads from real people's browsers with a browser extension. So I can't quite answer the question based on that, but there might be some answers in that data. Likewise, this is a kind of a fundamental challenge with looking at questions of like profile-based targeting. Like fake profiles are not real profiles. And so I think we have in our vision for this, this ad archive that I mentioned, I think we'd love to have and be able to compare also data sets from these different sources. So yeah, I don't quite have an answer, but I think it's an important question.
Thank you.
My name is Barry Leva. Thanks for the talk. Since ad blockers came up at the end on your last slide, I wonder if you might say a few words about the ongoing war between ad blockers and ad blocker detectors and what we might do about that.
Yeah, it's a good question. And in a way, the war is the same for our crawler, because our crawler relies on essentially ad blocker filter lists to detect the ads to see in the first place. So even if you're not blocking, but just detecting for transparency or other purposes, you have the same issue. I don't know the outcome of this arms race. I think it's, it's this fundamental tension between what users want, what websites want, the incentives of the different players in the now very complicated ecosystem. I actually wonder if thinking about ad content could maybe help here to some extent, because, for example, there are certain types of ads that people do genuinely like. Now, of course, there's a privacy question. That's another big issue that you can't actually ignore in this conversation. But for example, many people are probably fine seeing good ads on the websites that they want to support financially, but don't want to see the bad ads. So you could imagine that maybe a selective ad blocker that would incentivize good ad content might be a more middle ground in this arms race. Again, it's not a full solution. There's still the privacy issues. There's also the dream of what might the future web look like if we could move away from ads as the fundamental backbone of the web. I don't know how to move there, but that's probably the only way fully out of the arms race. I don't know.
Perhaps I misheard, but I thought you said that that even post-election that there were no ads contesting the outcome of the election, and given the extent to which that is appearing on news sites and everything, and how useful that is to inflame people and attract and everything, I found that an astonishing statement, that it somehow isn't in the ads, even though it's everywhere else. So could you explain or comment?
Yeah, I think there's a few things going on. One is that, I don't think it was the case that there were no ads that referenced the outcome of the election, or that maybe even cast doubt on it, or repackaged news headlines in sensational ways in the clickbait. But I don't think there was, for instance, there were no official political ads running any false claims. There was no headline that we saw, at least. It could just not be in our data. That explicitly said Trump won the election or something like that. It was more about, ongoing news, things like that. I don't remember any concrete examples. But I agree also, I was surprised. Well, one reason we kept running the crawlers for another 6 weeks after the election was we expected to see essentially more bad stuff. And in some ways we kind of saw more of the same type of stuff.
Well, given that, it seems like, like you noted, many of these ads, they're trying to leverage sensational things for various reasons. And given the prevalence of the belief that the outcome was not what it was, I don't know. Do you have any? I accept it's not like I was asking you to justify, but do you have any speculation as to why this wouldn't be in the ads, given the nature of what these ads are about and given the baseline beliefs that they're dealing with?
Yeah, it could be that there was more scrutiny on ad content during that time. There was the political ad ban from Google that overlapped this, but which, doesn't speak for all ad platforms. Yeah, I don't know. It's also possible that there was data in there that, you're making me want to go back to the data and look for some of these. We definitely didn't see any overtly false claims, but it would be interesting to go and recharacterize specifically the news headlines about election recounts or things like that, election challenges. Yeah. No, it's a good point. It's exactly the type of thing that gets clicks.
Okay, well, thank you. Scott?
Thanks for your talk. My question is about the next generation of, let's say, ads. And this is particularly related to, for example, in YouTube, I've noticed that ads are now getting integrated with the content itself. And so it seems that the ad creators are now paying the content creators instead of these ad platforms. So that means that the ad blockers don't work anymore. What would be your advice for the users? What should we do? Should we just continue moving forward the video, or yeah, like?
Yeah, what's the advice for the users is a very good question. I think perhaps like many security things, it's not fair that this responsibility fall to the users, even though in many ways it has. And I guess that's part of the arms race, is to make it basically impossible for users to do anything. I think it basically requires outside regulation and policies. Like poorly disclosed advertisements are already within the scope of what the FTC considers. But it's a challenge. I don't know if I have a good advice for users. It's a very good question. I am likewise fascinated by, the future of ads in all sorts of ways. And I mentioned augmented reality. I've also, in other research, we've been studying TikTok and TikTok content. And I'm likewise fascinated by TikTok ads, which, a TikTok ad has very different properties than others. Yeah, Paul mentions in the chat product placement in TV shows and movies. Yeah, I think probably again here there's a spectrum of, more problematic versions of these things and more manipulative versions of these things. And in some ways, all advertising is trying to, manipulate you, right? And I guess you can also decide whether I suspect people fall in different points of the spectrum of whether like all advertising is bad or what advertising is good. Yeah, I don't know. I think over time I've fallen at different points of that spectrum. I will admit that I have bought things that I clicked on from Instagram ads. So I don't know if that makes me, I don't know what that says about me or the ad ecosystem.
Right. Thank you.
With that, let's thank our speaker. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation and for all the great questions. I am on the Slack channel, so I'm happy to jump in there if there are more questions.